My brother stood at the front of that church, like he owned every pew, every hymn, every grief in the room. He had already changed the locks on Grandpa's farmhouse the night before the funeral. He had already told the family the land was his. And when I walked in alone and sat in the last row, not one person moved to make space for me. I did not cry. I did not argue. I did not even unpack the folder sitting in my bag. What Derek did not know was that the attorney who walked into that reading room 2 days later had driven 3 hours from Richmond. Not for him. Not even close. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. And hit like and subscribe if you have ever been pushed to the edge of your own family and chose silence over a scene. My name's Stephanie Cooper. I am 32 years old. I grew up in Clover Hill, Virginia, in a house where the rules were never written down, but everyone understood them perfectly. Derek was the favorite. I was the footnote. It was not something my mother ever said out loud. She didn't have to. It lived in the small things. The way she'd call Derek first when anything happened, good or bad. The way his college acceptance letter went on the refrigerator and mine went into a drawer. The way at every Thanksgiving table, someone would ask Derek about his plans, and then the conversations would simply move on before it reached me. I used to think I was imagining it. I stopped thinking that around the time I turned 16 and Derek wrecked Dad's truck and my mother told the insurance company it had been stolen. I left Clover Hill at 18 for the University of Virginia, studied pre-law because it was the one subject that felt like armor. By 26, I had passed the Virginia bar and joined a mid-sized firm in Richmond that specialized in estate planning and real property transactions. I drew up trusts, deeds, inheritance documents. I understood exactly how wealth moved from one generation to the next, and exactly how it could be redirected, protected, or stolen. I never told my family what I did for a living. Not in detail. My mother knew I was something in law. Derek knew I worked downtown somewhere. Neither of them ever asked a follow-up question, and I never offered one. At family dinners, when the subject came up, I'd say real estate paperwork and watch their eyes glaze over before I finished the sentence. It suited me fine. Grandpa Harold was different. Harold James Cooper was 79 years old when he died, and he had built everything from a single parcel of land his own father left him in 1971. 212 acres in Albemarle County. A farmhouse that had been expanded 3 times, a barn, 2 tenant cottages, a pond stocked with bass, and a back pasture that real estate developers had been circling like vultures for the better part of a decade. By any honest assessment, the estate was worth somewhere between $4 and $4.5 million. Opa, as I called him, knew that number exactly. He kept a leather notebook with every appraisal, every offer letter, every property tax bill going back 40 years. He was also the only person in my family who ever looked me in the eye when I spoke. When I was 12, he taught me to read a survey map. When I was 23 and studying for the bar, he mailed me a card with a $50 bill inside and a note that said, "The law is just memory with teeth. You'll be fine." I still have that card in my desk drawer in Richmond. Derek's relationship with Opa was more complicated, meaning Derek was warm and attentive whenever he needed something, and scarce the rest of the time. He'd borrowed money from Opa at least 3 times that I knew of. $15,000 for a business that never opened, $22,000 for a down payment on a house he later refinanced twice. A third amount I only heard about secondhand, something involving a truck and a failed hunting lease. Opa never said a word about any of it at the dinner table. He just wrote the checks and watched. I noticed over the last few years of Opa's life that Derek started showing up more. Phone calls on weekday mornings, surprise visits on Sundays. He'd started calling Opa Pop instead of Grandpa, which Opa never corrected, but which I noticed made the old man go slightly quiet. Derek brought his girlfriend to the farm for a long weekend in the spring of the year Opa got sick. He took photos of the barn, the pasture, the view from the back porch, posted them on social media with the caption, "Legacy." Opa was diagnosed with congestive heart failure in February. He declined steadily through the spring and into summer. By July, he was mostly in the house, then mostly in one chair, then mostly in bed. My mother took over coordinating his care, which meant she was at the farm 3 days a week, which meant Derek was there almost as often. I drove up from Richmond every other weekend. I brought groceries, sat with Opa in the afternoons, read to him when his eyes were tired. We talked about the farm, about property law, about a case I was working on involving a disputed boundary line 2 counties over. He was sharp until very near the end. There is one afternoon I return to often in my memory. Late August. A Thursday, Opa and I were on the back porch. The light was doing that thing it does in Virginia in late summer, going gold and long across the pasture. He had a glass of sweet tea going warm on the armrest, and he was quiet for a long time before he said, "Stephanie, I need to ask you something professional." I told him to go ahead. He asked me if I trusted the firm I worked for to keep something confidential. I said yes. He nodded slowly and looked back out at the pasture. He said, "I've been watching a long time. I know what happens to things when people are greedy and no one planned carefully." Then he looked at me directly and said, "I want to plan carefully, and I need someone I can trust absolutely to help me do it." I put down my glass. I said, "Tell me what you need." Opa, that was the beginning of something neither of us spoke about again for 6 months. Not to each other, and not to anyone else. Opa died on a Tuesday in October at 11:14 in the evening, in the bedroom he had slept in for 41 years. I was there. I had driven up from Richmond that afternoon because his nurse called and said his breathing had changed. My mother was already at the house when I arrived. She nodded at me from across the kitchen and said nothing. Derek showed up around 8, still in his work clothes, smelling faintly of a restaurant somewhere. He kissed Opa on the forehead, stood at the bedside for about 4 minutes, then went to the living room to make phone calls. I stayed in the room. I held Opa's hand through the last 2 hours. His breathing slowed the way the nurse had described it would. Uneven, then spaced, then very quiet. At the end there was almost no sound at all, just the lamp on the nightstand, the October dark outside the window, and his hand growing still in mine. I sat with him a few minutes after. Then I walked out to the hallway and told my mother. What happened in the next 40 minutes, I have gone over many times since, trying to locate the exact moment the evening turned. I think it was when Derek came back down the hall with his phone still in his hand and said, loudly, to no one in particular, "Okay, so we need to figure out the situation with the property. Not, we lost him. Not, I can't believe he's gone. The situation with the property." My mother nodded, like this was a reasonable thing to say in the 11:30 hour with Opa's body still warm down the hall. Derek pulled a folded paper from the inside pocket of his jacket. I did not know then what it was. I learned later it was a handwritten document he had apparently asked Opa to sign sometime in September, describing, in vague language Derek had drafted himself, a mutual understanding that the farm and its assets would pass to Derek upon Harold's death, in recognition of Derek's years of support and presence. It was not witnessed, it was not notarized. It was not worth the paper it was printed on under Virginia law, which I knew, and Derek apparently did not. He unfolded it and held it up in the kitchen light. He said, "Grandpa and I had an understanding. It's all written down, the farm, the accounts, everything. We talked about it for years." My mother looked at the paper and said, "Of course, that's what he wanted." 3 of my aunts were in the kitchen by then, having arrived in the previous hour. They looked at the paper. 2 of them nodded. One of them said that sounded right. No one looked at me, then Derek did. He turned, the paper still in his hand, and he looked directly at me with an expression I can only describe as preemptive. Like he was solving a problem before it presented itself, he said, "Stephanie, I know this might be hard to hear. You were never really involved with the farm. You moved away, you built your own life. That's fine. But Grandpa told me everything goes to me. He said you'd understand." He paused then, he said, "You were never really part of this family's future. And I think on some level you always knew that the kitchen was very quiet. I remember the hum of the refrigerator. I remember one of my aunts looking down at her coffee mug. I remember my mother's face, which was arranged into an expression of careful sympathy, the kind you'd show someone who had just been told something disappointing but fair." I looked at Derek. I looked at the paper. I looked at my mother. I picked up my coat from the back of the chair where I had set it 4 hours earlier when I arrived to sit with Opa while he was dying. I said, "Okay, Derek, that was all." I walked out the back door, got into my car, and drove 40 minutes to the Holiday Inn on Route 29 because I could not sleep in that house. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed with my coat still on for a while. Then I opened my laptop and sent a single email to one person. The subject line was 4 words. "It's time. I'm ready." The reply came back in 11 minutes. It said, "I'll be there. Tell me when." I closed the laptop. I took off my coat. I set an alarm for 6:30 because there were things to do in the morning, and I needed to be sharp for all of them. I did not cry that night. Not because I wasn't grieving. I was, in a way that had nothing to do with what Derek had said in that kitchen. I was grieving the man who had taught me to read a survey map when I was 12, who had mailed me a card with $50 and a note about memory and teeth, who had looked me in the eye on a back porch in August and said, "I need someone I can trust absolutely." I had been that person. I had done what he asked. And now it was time to let that matter. Derek changed the locks on the farmhouse the following morning. My mother called to tell me, as though delivering neutral information about the weather. I thanked her for letting me know. The 3 days between Opa's death and his funeral were the quietest I have ever lived through, not peaceful quiet, the other kind, the kind that has pressure in it, like the air before a storm, when the birds stop moving. I stayed at the Holiday Inn through Wednesday. I drove to a diner each morning and ate eggs and read through documents on my laptop. I answered work emails. I called my assistant in Richmond and told her to clear my calendar for the week. I did not call my mother. I did not call Derek. On Wednesday afternoon, my phone began filling up with messages from the family group chat. Arrangements for the service, flower choices, who was bringing what dish to the reception. Someone asking whether Opa's navy suit or his gray one should be used for the viewing. I read every message. I did not respond to a single one. That evening, I noticed I had been removed from the group entirely. I set my phone face down on the nightstand and went to sleep at 9 o'clock. Thursday morning, I drove to a coffee shop in Charlottesville and met with James Whitfield. James was 61, a sole practitioner with an office above a dry cleaner on Water Street, and he had been Opa's personal attorney for the better part of 20 years. He was also the man who had replied to my email in 11 minutes on the night Opa died. He had a beard going white at the edges and a habit of folding his hands on the table when he was about to say something important. He folded his hands, he said, "Harold's trust document is fully executed, fully funded, and properly recorded. There is nothing Derek can do to touch it. Not the land, not the accounts, not the cottage properties." I asked about the handwritten paper Derek had produced in the kitchen. James looked at me over his reading glasses. He said, "A handwritten, unwitnessed, unnotarized document asserting an informal inheritance agreement is not a valid testamentary instrument under Virginia law. It is at best a piece of paper with Harold's signature on it. It establishes nothing." He paused, then he said, "I'd also note that Harold specifically anticipated Derek might produce something like that. There is language in the trust addressing attempts to establish competing claims through informal documents. The trust includes a no-contest clause with very explicit teeth." I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup. I said, "When is the reading scheduled?" He said, "I've sent formal notice to all named parties. The reading is set for Friday afternoon, 2 days after the service. My office, 2 o'clock. I nodded. James looked at me carefully. He said, "Stephanie, I want to ask you something. You have known the contents of this trust for 6 months. You have watched your family proceed as though none of it exists. You could have said something at any point." I said. "Opa asked me not to. He said he wanted everyone to show their true character before the document spoke for itself. He said the waiting would tell him everything he needed to know." James was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He was a very deliberate man." I said, "Yes, he was." I drove back to the hotel, ordered room service, and spent the evening going through the trust document one more time. Not because I needed to. I had read it enough times to recall it nearly verbatim, but because there was something steadying about the language, the precision of it. Every contingency addressed, every asset named, every scenario Harold had foreseen, planned for, and resolved on paper with the careful hand of a man who had spent his life learning that what you leave behind matters more than what you say out loud. He had told me once, on that same August afternoon on the back porch, that the hardest part of building something was knowing who to trust with it after you were gone. He had chosen me. Not because I was the most present. Not because I called the most, or visited the most, or brought the most groceries, or sat in the most chairs at the most bedsides. Derek had done some of those things too in his way, for his reasons. Opa had chosen me because he handed me a problem, and I solved it quietly, completely, and without once asking what was in it for me. He told me that directly, the day we signed the documents at James's office. He said, "You didn't ask. That's how I knew." I thought about that on the hotel bed Thursday night, staring at the ceiling, while Derek was presumably at the farmhouse going through drawers and making phone calls to developers, and telling anyone who would listen that it was all settled, all taken care of, all his. I thought, let him. 2 more days, I set my alarm, turned off the light, and slept better than I had in weeks. The morning of the funeral, I put on the black dress I had packed before I left Richmond, because I had known this day was coming. I drove to the church alone. I arrived early, chose a pew near the back, and set my coat on the seat beside me. The church filled up slowly. Extended family, neighbors, men Opa had known through the county agricultural board, a few faces I recognized from decades of holidays. They filled the front rows, the middle rows. Several people saw me and nodded. A few came and embraced me. Most moved toward the front, toward my mother, toward Derek, who stood near the entrance in a dark suit, shaking hands with the steady ease of a man, receiving condolences he felt he had earned. At one point, my mother looked back and saw me sitting alone in the last row. She turned back to the front without a word. Derek spoke during the service. He talked about Opa's legacy, his land, his strength. He said the farm would remain in the family and be honored the way Harold would have wanted. Several people nodded. An older woman near the front pressed a handkerchief to her face. I sat with my hands folded in my lap and listened. There was a folder in my bag. I did not open it. I did not need to. Everything in it I already knew by heart, and in less than 48 hours, so would everyone else in that room who thought they already knew how this story ended. 6 months earlier, on a Thursday in late August, I had driven up from Richmond in the early afternoon with a bag of groceries and a case file I planned to review on his back porch. I did not know, when I turned off Route 250 and onto the gravel lane that cuts through the east pasture, that the afternoon would become one of the most significant of my life. I thought I was making one of my regular visits. I thought I would sit with Opa, make him a sandwich, read my case file, and drive home before dark. Opa was in better shape that day than he had been the week before. He was in his chair on the back porch when I arrived, upright, alert, with his leather notebook open on the armrest. The sweet tea was already made. He had been waiting for me. We talked for a while about ordinary things, a neighbor's fence line dispute, the base population in the pond, which he said was down from last year. A piece in the local paper about a developer who had proposed turning a farm 2 counties over into a distribution center. Opa shook his head at that one slowly, the way he did when something offended a principle he held too deeply to argue about out loud. Then he went quiet. That particular quiet I had learned over 32 years to take seriously. The one that meant he was about to say the thing he had actually been building toward. He looked out at the pasture, he said. I've been doing a lot of thinking. I closed my case file, he said. I've watched what happens in families when there's land and money and nobody planned carefully. I've watched it in this county my whole life. Good people, bad endings. Not because they were bad people. Because they didn't write the right things down before they couldn't write anymore. He turned and looked at me directly. He said, I've also been watching Derek. I did not say anything. He said, I'm not a naive man, Stephanie. I know what it means when someone who never cared much about Sunday dinners starts showing up every week. I know what it means when a man takes photographs of a barn and calls it legacy. He paused. I've let him come. I've let him think what he wants to think. Because I needed to know what he would do when he thought it was already decided. He picked up the leather notebook. He held it for a moment without opening it. He said, 3 months ago, I met with James Whitfield. I told him I wanted to establish a revocable living trust. I told him I wanted to fund it with the farm, the 2 cottages, and the liquid accounts, all of it. And I told him I wanted you as sole trustee and sole primary beneficiary. The back porch was very still. I said, Opa. He held up one hand. He said, let me finish. He set the notebook down. James drew up the framework, but I told him I wanted you to review the document before we executed it. Not because I don't trust James, I do completely. But because you are an estate attorney and this is your work, and I want the document to be exactly right. I want no gaps. I want no ambiguity. I want nothing Derek or anyone else can put a finger on and say was unclear. He looked at me steadily. He said, I know what I'm asking. I know it puts you in a position, but you are the only person I trust to do this correctly and keep it quiet until the right moment. Can you do that? I looked at my grandfather, 79 years old, smaller than he used to be in the chair, his hands spotted and careful on the armrest, his eyes completely clear. I said, yes, I can do that. He nodded once. The way he nodded when something was decided and did not need to be revisited. We drove to James Whitfield's office the following Tuesday. I reviewed the full trust document, 41 pages, over the preceding weekend. I found 3 areas where I recommended tightening the language. One around the definition of estate assets to explicitly include mineral rights, one around the no contest clause to remove any ambiguity about what constituted a challenge, and one small technical correction in the trustee succession provision. James incorporated every change without argument. He said when we were done, "Harold, this is as clean a document as I've produced in 30 years." Opa signed on a Tuesday afternoon at 2:15. James notarized. His paralegal and a colleague from the next office served as witnesses. The document was recorded with the county clerk the following morning. Opa and I drove back to the farm in his truck. He was quiet the whole way. When we pulled up to the house, he sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel, looking at the farmhouse, the barn, the line of oaks along the fence. He said, "I built this from 40 acres and a tractor with a cracked manifold. My father left me that land and I didn't waste it." He paused. "I want it to mean something after I'm gone. Not just money. Something." I said, "It will." He said, "I know. That's why I asked you." We did not discuss the trust again after that day. Not once in the months that followed. Not when his health declined. Not when Derek began appearing every weekend. Not when my mother started coordinating his care and subtly repositioning herself as the family's central authority on all things Harold. I came every other weekend. I brought groceries. I sat on the porch or beside his bed. We talked about property law, about the bass in the pond, about a book he was reading on the Civil War in Virginia. He never mentioned the trust. Neither did I, but sometimes, when I was leaving, he would catch my hand at the door and hold it for a moment. He wouldn't say anything, he'd just look at me with those clear eyes and nod. That was enough. In the weeks after his death, when Derek was changing locks and calling developers and telling the family it was all settled, I thought about those moments at the door. The handshake that wasn't really a handshake, the nod that meant, "I see you." I chose carefully, hold the line. I held the line, 1 day left until James Whitfield's office. 1 day left until 2 o'clock, on a Friday afternoon, when a room full of people who thought they knew exactly how this story ended would find out they had been reading the wrong document entirely. I went to bed Thursday night at the Holiday Inn with the alarm set for 7. I slept without dreaming. The morning after the funeral, Derek called me at 8:13. I was in the hotel parking lot, coffee in hand, about to get into my car. I looked at the screen. I let it ring 4 times. Then I answered. He did not start with hello. He said, "I need you to come by the farm this morning. There are some documents I need you to sign." I said, "What documents?" He said, "A disclaimer of interest. Standard stuff. Just a formality that cleans up the estate paperwork so we can move forward without complications. A disclaimer of interest is a legal instrument by which an heir formally renounces any claim to an inheritance. It is irrevocable once signed. It is not, under any definition, standard stuff. It is the kind of document you present to someone when you are worried they might have a legitimate claim and you need them to voluntarily surrender it before they find out how legitimate it actually is." I looked across the parking lot at the tree line behind the hotel. A crow was sitting on a fence post doing nothing in particular. I said, "I'll have to look at it first, Derek." He said, "It's simple, Stephanie. It's 1 page. Our attorney drafted it." I said, "When did you get an attorney?" A brief pause. "Then I've had some looking at things for a few weeks. Just to make sure everything is in order." I said, "I see." He said, "Look, I know yesterday was hard. For all of us. But Grandpa was clear about his wishes, and the sooner we get this wrapped up the better for everyone. I'm trying to protect the family here." I noticed he said the family, not you. Not us. The family, as though he were a steward of something larger than himself, acting on behalf of others, performing a reluctant duty. I said, "I appreciate that, Derek. I'll be in touch." He said, "I need this done today, Stephanie." "The attorney has a deadline." I said, "I understand." I ended the call, got in the car, and drove to the diner on Route 29 where I had been eating breakfast all week. I ordered eggs and wheat toast and a second coffee. I wrote 3 notes in the margin of a legal pad I kept in my bag. Then I called James Whitfield. James picked up on the second ring. I told him about the call. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "He's moving faster than I expected. That tells me he's either more anxious than he's letting on, or someone advised him to get your signature before Friday." I said, "Or both." James said, "Don't sign anything. Don't go to the farm. If he calls again, say you're consulting your own attorney." "That's true, and it closes the conversation." I said I understood. Then I asked him something I had been thinking about since the parking lot. I said, "James, is there anything Derek could do between now and 2 o'clock tomorrow that would affect the trust?" James said, "No, the trust is recorded. It is a matter of public record. The assets transferred to the trust during Harold's lifetime, they are not part of the probate estate at all. There is nothing to contest, nothing to intercept, nothing to redirect. The document speaks for itself the moment we open it in my office, I said. And the handwritten paper, he said. Unenforceable. I've already pulled the county records. Harold made no amendments, no codicils, no competing documents through any official channel. Whatever Derek is holding is not a legal instrument. I thanked him and hung up. I sat with my eggs and my coffee and the legal pad for another 20 minutes. Derek called again at 11:40. I let it go to voicemail. His message was 3 sentences. He needed the signature by end of day. The attorney had confirmed the deadline, and he hoped I understood that making this difficult would only hurt the family. I saved the voicemail. I always save voicemails. At 2 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. It said, "This is Connor Marsh, attorney for Derek Cooper. Please call me at your earliest convenience regarding the Cooper estate matter." Time sensitive, I forwarded the text to James. James replied within 4 minutes. Ignore. He has no standing to contact you directly regarding a trust he doesn't know exists. Save the message. I saved it. That evening I drove out to the farm. Not to go inside. I had no key and no intention of asking for one. I parked on the gravel lane near the east pasture gate and sat in the car as the light went, gold and long across the 212 acres that Opa had built from a cracked tractor manifold and 40 years of careful, patient work. The farmhouse windows were lit. Derek's truck was in the driveway. There was another vehicle I didn't recognize, a dark SUV, newer model. The attorney probably, or the developer's representative, or both. Voices maybe. Documents spread on Opa's kitchen table. Plans being made with confident hands. I sat there for a while. I thought about the last time I had driven this lane with Opa in the truck beside me, his hands on the wheel, looking at his oaks. I thought about the way he said, "I built this from 40 acres and a tractor with a cracked manifold." I thought about what he had not said, which was, "And I will decide exactly who keeps it." Derek's light was on in the room that had been Opa's study. I watched it for a moment. Then I put the car in reverse, backed out onto the road, and drove to the hotel, 18 hours. I ordered room service and reviewed my notes one final time, not because I needed to, but because there is something in preparation that feels like respect. For the work, for the moment, for the man who had made the moment possible. I was ready by Thursday evening. Derek had apparently decided that legal pressure was not moving fast enough. So he moved to a different kind of pressure entirely. My cousin Renee called me at 7:15 that night. Renee was 38, lived in Charlottesville, and occupied the particular family role of information relay. Not malicious exactly, but constitutionally unable to sit on news. She said she was calling to check on me. Within 90 seconds, it was clear she was calling because Derek had gotten to her first. She said carefully, "Stephanie, I don't know how to say this, but some people in the family are worried about you, about how you've been handling everything." I said, "Handling what specifically?" She said, "Derek mentioned that Grandpa had expressed some concerns, before he passed, about she paused, your stability. He said Grandpa told him you'd been going through a hard time, and that was part of why he made the arrangements he made." I set down the glass of water I was holding. I said, "Derek said Grandpa told him I was unstable." Renee said, "He said Grandpa was worried that you'd been under a lot of stress with work, and that he didn't want to burden you with the responsibilities of the estate. He said that's why everything was arranged the way it was." I considered this for a moment. The architecture of it was almost elegant, preemptively discrediting me, framing any objection I raised as evidence of the instability being claimed. If I protested, I was proving the point. If I stayed quiet, the story spread unchallenged. I said, "Renee, I appreciate you calling me." She said, "I just thought you should know what's being said." I said, "I do know. Thank you." I ended the call and sat on the edge of the hotel bed. Then my mother sent an email, not a call, an email, which told me she had written it carefully, possibly with Derek's input. It was addressed to what appeared to be a list of 12 or 15 family members, with me included. The subject line was, "Harold's wishes. Important update." The email said that following Harold's passing, Derek had assumed responsibility for the estate in accordance with Harold's clearly expressed wishes. It said the family should direct any questions to Derek or his attorney. It said that while Harold had loved all his grandchildren, his final years had shown him the importance of having family members who were present and actively involved in his care. A role Derek had fulfilled with dedication. I was mentioned once, near the end, in a sentence that said, "Stephanie has understandably found this transition difficult, and we ask that the family be patient and kind with her during this time." understandably found this transition difficult. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to James Whitfield with a single line. For the file, he replied at 9:47 received. This may actually be useful tomorrow. See you at 2. I did not sleep immediately that night. I lay in the dark for a while and let myself feel it. Not the anger, which was there but clean and manageable, but the older thing underneath it. The thing that had been there since the refrigerator door, since the truck that got reported stolen, since every Thanksgiving table where the conversation moved on, before it reached me. The thing that said, "You were always going to be the one sitting in the back row." I let myself feel it for about 20 minutes. Then I made a decision I had been turning over for several days, one that Opa had not specifically requested, but that I believed he would have approved. I picked up my phone and sent a text to 4 people. The first was my college roommate Dana, now a staff reporter at the Richmond Times-Dispatch. I did not tell her anything specific. I told her I thought she might want to be available Friday afternoon in case a story developed in Albemarle County involving a contested estate and a family with generational land holdings. I told her to call me at 4 o'clock. The second was my colleague Marcus Webb, a senior partner at my firm who had been a practicing real estate litigator for 22 years. I asked him to clear his Friday afternoon and be reachable by phone. The third was a woman named Gloria Chen, a financial forensics consultant I had worked with on 2 previous cases involving disputed inheritance assets. I asked her to pull any public records she could find on transactions involving the Cooper Farm parcels in Albemarle County, filed in the last 60 days. The fourth text was to James Whitfield. It said, 2 additional items for tomorrow. First, I'd like you to have a copy of the recorded trust document visible on the table before Derek arrives. Not opened, just present. Second, is there any possibility of having a notary on site? James replied in 6 minutes. Both done. The notary is my paralegal. She'll be there. I set the phone down. Gloria Chen replied at 11:19 that night. Her message was 9 words. Found something. Filed 10 days ago. Call me in the morning. I stared at the ceiling. 10 days ago was 4 days after Opa died. Whatever Derek had filed in the county records in the week following Opa's death, he had done it fast. Faster than someone acts when they are confident. Fast like someone who knows the clock is running and doesn't understand exactly when it runs out. I called Gloria at 7 the next morning, standing in the hotel parking lot with my coffee before the diner opened. She said, "Your brother filed a deed of sale on a 14-acre parcel on the eastern boundary of the farm. Buyer is listed as Meridian Property Group, LLC. Sale price recorded at $800,000. He accepted a deposit of $200,000. My hand tightened on the coffee cup. I said, "When was it recorded?" She said, 7 days after Harold Cooper's death. Before any formal probate proceeding. Before any legal confirmation of inheritance, I said. He sold land he didn't own yet, Gloria said. He sold land he never owned at all, if what you've told me about the trust is accurate. Which means the deed is void. Which means Meridian Property Group paid $200,000 toward a transaction that cannot legally close. I closed my eyes for a moment. I thought, Derek, you did it to yourself. Then I thanked Gloria, got in the car, drove to the diner, and ate a full breakfast: eggs, wheat toast, orange juice. I read the news on my phone. I tipped the waitress $4 on an $11 check. At 1:45, I drove to James Whitfield's office on Water Street and parked in the lot behind the dry cleaner. I checked my hair in the mirror. I walked inside. James Whitfield's office was on the second floor above the dry cleaner, reached by a narrow staircase that smelled faintly of cleaning solvent and old wood. I had been up those stairs twice before, once when Opa and I came to sign the trust documents, and once in September when I stopped by alone to review the final recorded copy. Both times the office had been quiet, unhurried, the kind of place where careful work got done without performance. Today it felt different. James's paralegal, a composed woman named Ruth, who had been with him for 16 years, met me at the top of the stairs at 1:50. She shook my hand and told me the conference room was ready. She said 2 other parties had called to confirm. Derek and his attorney, and my mother. She said they had also received an unexpected call from a representative of Meridian Property Group. Who had requested to send their own counsel, I said. What did James tell them? Ruth said. He told them the reading was a matter of public notification and they were welcome to send a representative, provided they understood they had no standing to participate. I nodded. She led me to the conference room. It was a rectangular room with a long oak table, 6 chairs, and 2 windows that looked out over Water Street. A credenza ran along one wall. On the table, centered precisely, was a manila folder with a blue cover sheet. Next to it, slightly to the left, was a second document in a clear binding, thicker, the edges of its pages slightly worn from handling. The recorded trust. James had placed it exactly as I had asked. Visible, present, unopened. I sat in the chair at the far end of the table, my back to the window. I set my bag on the floor beside me. I folded my hands on the table. Ruth brought me a glass of water and closed the door quietly behind her. I sat alone in the room for 4 minutes. I used that time to do something I had not allowed myself to do in the weeks since Opa died. I thought about him directly, not strategically, not in relation to documents or deadlines or recorded deeds, just him, the leather notebook, the sweet tea going warm. The way he said "I know what I'm asking" on the back porch in August. The way that sentence carried in it a whole lifetime of watching and waiting and understanding that the right moment for a thing was not always the first moment or the loudest moment, but the one you had prepared for so carefully that when it arrived it felt inevitable. He had prepared for this room. He had prepared for this table, this folder, this afternoon in October. He just hadn't been able to be here for it himself, I thought. I'll do it for both of us, Opa. The door opened at 1:58. Derek came in first, in a dark jacket and open collar, his attorney Connor Marsh behind him. Younger than I expected, mid-30s, with the slightly overpressed look of someone trying to project competence at a higher volume than they actually possessed. My mother followed, in a black dress she had worn to the funeral, her face arranged in its careful expression. Behind her, a woman I didn't recognize, 40s, business casual, with a leather portfolio under her arm. Meridian's representative. I assumed Derek saw me immediately. Something moved across his face, surprise quickly managed. He had expected me to be elsewhere, or absent, or already defeated in some way. He hadn't specified to himself. He pulled out the chair at the opposite end of the table from me and sat down as though claiming it. His attorney sat to his right and opened a slim folder of his own. My mother sat without looking at me. James Whitfield came in at 2 o'clock exactly, Ruth behind him with a notepad. James set his reading glasses on his nose, placed a hand briefly on the back of his chair, and looked around the table. He said, "Thank you all for being here. I am James Whitfield, and I served as personal attorney to Harold James Cooper for the last 19 years. I'll ask everyone to hold questions until I have finished the document presentation. At that point, I'll take questions in order," Derek's attorney said. "Before we begin, I'd like to note for the record that my client, Derek Allen Cooper, holds a signed document from Harold Cooper dated September 14th, expressing Harold's intention to transfer the estate to Derek. We'd like that document entered into these proceedings." James looked at him over his glasses. He said, "You may certainly note its existence, Counselor. Its relevance will become clear shortly." He opened the manila folder. He said, "Harold James Cooper did not leave a conventional last will and testament. What Harold left was a revocable living trust, executed on September 2nd of this year, fully funded, and recorded with the Albemarle County Clerk's Office on September 4th. He paused. "The trust document is the instrument before you in the clear binding. I will now read the operative provisions." Derek's attorney started to say something. James held up one hand without looking at him and kept reading. The trust language was precise, as I had helped make it. James read the asset schedule first. The farmhouse and all outbuildings, 212 acres, including mineral and timber rights. The 2 tenant cottages on the north boundary, and liquid accounts totaling $940,000. $4.2 million in aggregate at current assessed value. Then he read the beneficiary designation. He said, "The sole primary beneficiary of the Harold James Cooper Living Trust is Stephanie Ann Cooper, granddaughter of the truster, currently residing in Richmond, Virginia." He looked up briefly. Derek had gone very still. James continued. He read the trustee succession provision, the asset management guidelines, the distribution schedule. Then he reached the provision I had drafted myself, in the margin notes of a legal pad at a hotel diner on Route 29, and refined over 3 subsequent drafts with James until the language was without question. He read, "Any party who initiates legal proceedings to challenge, contest, or invalidate this trust instrument, or who has executed or recorded any instrument purporting to transfer, encumber, or otherwise dispose of trust assets prior to or following the truster's death, shall forfeit any and all contingent interests under this trust, and shall be liable to the trust estate for damages arising from such actions." James set the document down. He looked at Derek. He said, "Mr. Cooper, I am also obligated to inform you that this office became aware this morning of a deed of sale recorded in Albemarle County 7 days following Harold's death, conveying a 14-acre parcel of trust property to Meridian Property Group LLC. As that parcel was trust property at the time of its purported sale, the deed is void as a matter of law. The deposit funds received in that transaction are subject to immediate recovery proceedings. The Meridian representative opened her portfolio and wrote something. Derek's attorney said something sharp and procedural that I didn't fully track. My mother made a sound I had not heard from her before. Not a word. Just a sound. Derek himself said nothing. He was looking at the clear binding on the table, the worn edges of the trust document, the document that had existed since September 4th, 3 weeks before he stood in Opa's kitchen with his handwritten paper and told me I was never really part of this family's future. His face had gone the color of old plaster. His hands, I noticed, were completely flat on the table, as though he needed to feel something solid beneath them. I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked away, outside the window on Water Street. An ordinary Friday afternoon was happening. A woman walked a dog. A truck made a delivery. A cloud moved across the sun, and the light in the room shifted briefly, then steadied. James folded his hands. He said, "I'll now take questions." The questions began badly and got worse. Derek's attorney, Connor Marsh, went first. He had recovered some composure in the 30 seconds since James finished reading, enough to adopt a tone of measured professional skepticism that I recognized immediately as a man performing confidence he did not feel. He said, "We'd like to examine the execution date of this document relative to Harold Cooper's documented medical condition in September. There is a question of testamentary capacity that we believe warrants review," James said. The trust was executed September 2nd. Harold's primary care physician documented his cognitive status as fully intact through mid-October. "I have that letter in the file. Would you like a copy?" Marsh said. "We'd also like to examine the circumstances under which the trust was drafted, given that the named beneficiary is herself an estate attorney who was present during the process." James said, "The trust was drafted by this office. I am Harold's attorney of 19 years. Miss Cooper reviewed the document at Harold's specific request and made technical recommendations that I incorporated. Her involvement was at the truster's direction, fully disclosed, and creates no conflict of interest under Virginia law. If you'd like the case citations on that point, Ruth can print them for you." Marsh paused. He wrote something on his notepad. My mother spoke for the first time. She said, "Harold never mentioned this to me, not once. I was with him 3 days a week for months. He would have told me," James said. "Harold specifically instructed that the trust remain confidential until the reading. That instruction is documented in the trust file, in a letter of direction signed by Harold on September 2nd, the same day the trust was executed." My mother looked at me then, really looked at me, for what felt like the first time in years. Her expression was not grief exactly. It was something more complicated, the look of a woman recalculating a long series of assumptions and finding each one wrong, one after another, like a row of doors opening onto empty rooms. I held her gaze. I did not look away first. Derek had been silent through all of this. His attorney was doing the talking, which told me Derek was either too stunned to speak or had been advised to stay quiet, possibly both. He was sitting very straight in his chair, which I had learned over 32 years meant he was frightened. Derek went very still and very upright when he was frightened. It was the opposite of how most people held fear in their bodies. Then something shifted. I watched it happen. Some internal calculation concluded, some decision made, and Derek leaned forward and put both forearms on the table and looked down its length directly at me. He said, "Stephanie, I want to talk to you directly." I said, "Go ahead," he said. "I know you and I have had our differences. I know the family hasn't always been easy. But Grandpa Opa, he loved us both. Whatever this document says, I don't think he would have wanted us sitting across a table like this. I think he would have wanted the family to figure this out together. He always said family first." I looked at him. Family first. In 32 years I had never once heard Opa say family first. What Opa said was, "Do the right thing slowly and you only have to do it once." I said, "Derek, when did Opa ever say family first?" He blinked. I said specifically, "When did he say it?" A pause that lasted slightly too long. He said, "It was his whole philosophy." I said, "His whole philosophy was careful planning and honest dealing. Which is why we are sitting in this room right now." Marsh put a hand on Derek's arm. Derek looked at the trust document in its clear binding. He looked at James. Then he said something that I do not think he intended to say out loud. The words of a man who had just run the numbers in his head and arrived at a figure he could not absorb. He said, "How much did he leave her?" James said, "I've read the full asset schedule, Mr. Cooper. The trust value at current assessment is $4,240,000, inclusive of real property, structures, mineral rights, and liquid accounts." Derek's mouth opened slightly. He closed it, his attorney said quietly, "Derek." Derek said nothing. My mother pressed 3 fingers to her lips and looked at the window. The Meridian representative wrote something in her portfolio, tore the page out neatly, and slid it across the table to Marsh without a word. Marsh looked at it. He looked at Derek. He said, very quietly, "We need to discuss the deposit situation," Derek said. "What deposit situation?" Marsh said. "The 200,000, Derek said. "That's handled." "Connor, I told you," Marsh said. "Derek, the deed is void. The sale never legally occurred. Meridian's deposit is recoverable, and they will recover it. That is not a negotiation, that is a liability you are currently holding." The room went very quiet. I had been waiting for this moment, not with pleasure exactly, more with the feeling of watching something resolve into its correct shape. The feeling of a legal instrument doing precisely what it was designed to do. I said, "James, I'd like to make a statement for the record." James said, "Go ahead," I said. "I want to be clear about my intentions regarding this estate. I intend to honor the spirit of what Opa built here. The farm will not be sold to developers. The tenant cottages will remain occupied. I am establishing a charitable foundation in Harold Cooper's name to support agricultural preservation in Albemarle County. These are not negotiating positions. They are decisions I have already made." I paused, then I said, "I also want to say, for the record, that I bear no personal animus toward anyone in this room. Opa made his choices. I am going to honor them," Marsh said. "My client would like to reserve the right to," I said. "James, would you please read the no contest clause again? Specifically the penalty provision." James found the page. He read it clearly, without inflection, the way good legal language is meant to be read, as plain statement, not threat. Every phrase landing in the room like a stone into still water. When he finished, Marsh set his pen down. He did not pick it up again. Derek had been looking at the table throughout. Now he looked up and his eyes found mine, and I saw something in them I had not expected. Not rage. I had prepared for rage. Not calculation. I had prepared for that too. What I saw was something older. Something that looked, if I am being precise, almost like recognition. As though some part of Derek that existed beneath the jacket, and the handwritten paper, and the changed locks, and the sold parcel, and the emails, and the voice missiles, and the 32 years of golden child arrangements. Some part of him that remembered who we actually were to each other, once a long time ago, was surfacing briefly, like something coming up for air. It lasted about 4 seconds, then it went back under. He pushed his chair back from the table. He said, "I need some air." He stood up and walked to the door and went out into the hallway. His footsteps went down the narrow staircase. The street door opened and closed. Connor Marsh gathered his papers methodically, the way a man cleans up after a conclusion he saw coming and could not prevent. He said he would be in touch with James regarding the Meridian matter. He shook James's hand. He nodded at me without quite meeting my eyes. He left. My mother sat for another moment after Marsh was gone. The room was very still. Ruth was writing something at the credenza. The Meridian representative was on her phone in the corner, quiet and businesslike. My mother looked at me. She said, "He knew." "Harold knew the whole time." I said, "Yes," she said, "and he told you." I said, "He asked me." She was quiet for a long time. Outside on Water Street, the afternoon was continuing its ordinary business, a bus passing, a light changing, the sound of someone's radio briefly audible and then gone. She said, finally, very quietly, "I thought I knew what he wanted." I said, "I know you did." I did not say anything else. There was nothing else to say that the afternoon had not already said more clearly than I could. She stood, picked up her bag, and walked to the door. At the threshold she stopped. She did not turn around. She said, "The house, the main house. Where will I?" I said, "We'll discuss it." "Not today." She nodded once. She left. The room was empty except for me and James and Ruth. James took off his reading glasses and set them on the table. He looked at me the way he had looked at me on that Tuesday in September when we finished the final draft. Not proud exactly, more like a man confirming that the thing he believed would hold had held. He said, "Harold would have been pleased." I looked at the trust document in its clear binding on the table. I said, "I know. The call from Gloria Chen came at 4:17 that afternoon. I was sitting in my car in the lot behind the dry cleaner, engine off, watching the shadow of the building stretch slowly across the pavement. I had been sitting there for about 20 minutes, not processing, not planning, just sitting. Letting the afternoon be what it was, Gloria said. Meridian moved fast. They filed a civil complaint against Derek Cooper at 3:50 this afternoon in Albemarle County Circuit Court. Breach of contract, fraudulent misrepresentation, recovery of deposit funds plus legal costs and damages. Their attorneys are not slow people. I said, how much are they seeking? Gloria said, the $200,000 in deposit plus an equal amount in consequential damages, plus fees. Call it $600,000 as a realistic exposure if it goes to judgment, I said. Does Derek have $600,000? Gloria paused in the way. She paused when the answer was not yes. She said, his personal financial picture is not strong. He refinanced his home in March for $240,000. He has a business line of credit with a local bank that is currently drawn to its limit. The truck is leased. His savings, based on what's publicly traceable, are— She paused again, not substantial, I said. So he sold land he didn't own in order to fund a life he couldn't afford, Gloria said. That is an accurate summary. I thanked her and sat with the phone in my lap for a while. I had known this, intellectually, since the morning. Since Gloria's 7 o'clock call in the parking lot with my coffee. The numbers were not a surprise. But there is a difference between knowing a thing as information and receiving it as reality. The weight of it settling differently. More specifically, in the body, Derek had not been greedy in the abstract. He had been desperate. And desperation had made him reckless in exactly the way Opa had foreseen. I thought about the leather notebook on the porch armrest. I thought about the way Opa had said, I've been watching a long time. He had seen this coming years before I had. I started the car and drove back to the Holiday Inn. I showered and changed and called Dana at the Richmond Times-Dispatch. She had been in Charlottesville since noon. It turned out she had taken my Thursday night text seriously and driven up on her own judgment. She asked if I was willing to speak on record about the trust and the estate. I told her I would provide a brief written statement through James's office and that the public record documents would tell most of the story. She said that was enough. I ordered room service and ate dinner at the small desk by the window. The farm was 7 miles away. I could not see it from the hotel, but I knew the way the light would be sitting on the back pasture at this hour. The last of the October gold, going amber. The oaks along the fence holding their color a little longer than everything else. My phone had been busy since the reading. Renee had called 3 times. 2 aunts had texted. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in 4 years sent a long message that began with, I had no idea, and ended with something about wanting to reconnect. I read the messages and set the phone face down. There was one message I did not ignore. It came from an unknown number at 6:42 in the evening, a Virginia area code I didn't recognize. It was 4 sentences. It said, Miss Cooper, my name is Robert Aldean. I am a neighbor of your grandfather's on the south boundary. Harold spoke of you often over the years. I would very much like to speak with you when you have a moment. I looked at that message for a while. Opa had spoken of me to his neighbors. While Derek was changing locks and fielding developer calls, Opa had been talking about me to the man on the south boundary. I did not know Robert Aldean, but I wrote his number into my contacts and replied that I would call him in the next few days. At 9:15, my phone rang, with a number I recognized immediately. Connor Marsh. I let it ring twice. Then I answered. He did not waste time on preamble. He said, Miss Cooper, I want to be direct with you. I am no longer representing Derek Cooper as of this afternoon. I'm calling you in a personal capacity to tell you that my former client is in a position that is going to deteriorate significantly in the coming days. Meridian is serious, the complaint is solid, and there are aspects of Derek's financial situation that will become public through the litigation discovery process that he is not prepared for. I said, Why are you telling me this? He said, Because I made representations on his behalf today that I made in good faith based on information he provided me, and I have since learned that information was incomplete. I want it on record, even an informal record, that I acted without full knowledge. I said, I understand, he said. I also want to say, and this is entirely personal, not professional, that the trust document your grandfather executed is one of the cleanest instruments I've seen in 10 years of estate practice. Whoever reviewed it knew what they were doing. I said, Thank you, Mr. Marsh. He said, Good night, Miss Cooper. The line went quiet. I set the phone down and sat with that for a moment. Then I went to bed. What happened over the following 11 days happened fast. The way legal and financial collapses tend to, when the foundational documents are unambiguous. Meridian's complaint was served on Derek at his home on Saturday morning. By Monday, his personal attorney, a different one, not Marsh, had filed a response that James described to me as thin. By the following Friday, a judge had issued a preliminary finding that the Albemarle deed was void as a matter of law, which meant Meridian's recovery action was on solid ground and accelerating. Derek's bank called in his business line of credit on the Thursday of the second week. I learned this not through any official channel, but through Renee, who had apparently become my informal intelligence source, now that her earlier loyalties had been conclusively redistributed. She said Derek had gone to the bank in person, and the meeting had not gone well. She said he had come home and sat in his truck in the driveway for 40 minutes before going inside. I did not feel satisfaction at that image. I want to be precise about that. What I felt was something closer to sorrow, not for what Derek was losing, but for the distance between what he could have been and what he had chosen to be. The distance between the brother I had once, briefly, when we were very small, and the farm was just a place our grandfather lived, and none of the rest of it existed yet, and the man who had stood in Opa's kitchen with a handwritten paper and told me I was never really part of this family's future. That distance was not something a trust document had created. It had been created over 32 years, one small choice at a time. On the Friday of the second week after the reading, Derek called me. I answered. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I need to ask you something," I said. "Go ahead," he said. "Did Grandpa know?" "About the developer. About the deposit," I said. "Opa didn't know the specific transaction. He knew your patterns. He planned accordingly." Derek was quiet. Then he said, "He always knew everything, didn't he?" It was not quite a question. I said, "Yes, he did." Another silence. Longer this time, he said, "Stephanie," and then stopped. Whatever came after my name, he could not find it, or could not say it, or both. The sentence hung there unfinished, which felt, in its way, more honest than anything he had managed to say in the past 3 weeks. I said, "I know, Derek. I did not know, exactly. But I said it because it was the true thing to say. The thing that acknowledged that something had existed between us once that was not this, even if this was what we had arrived at." He said, "Okay." I said, "Okay." He hung up. I stood in the hotel parking lot. I was still at the Holiday Inn, having extended my stay day by day while the estate paperwork began its formal process, and looked at the sky. It was a cold, clear Friday in late October, the kind of Virginia day where the air has lost its softness completely, and everything is hard-edged and exact. The kind of day Opa had liked best. He always said you could see further in October than any other month. Something about the angle of the light. I stood there for a while, looking at the sky. Then I got in my car and drove the 7 miles to the farm. I unlocked the door with the key James had given me after the reading. The original farmhouse key, the one from his file, the one Opa had left with him years ago for exactly this moment. I walked through the house slowly. The kitchen, the hallway, the study with its maps and its account ledgers and its 40 years of careful record-keeping. The back porch, in the cold October afternoon, with the last of the light going gold and long across the pasture. I stood there for a long time, then I sat down in Opa's chair, and for the first time since the night he died I let myself cry. 14 months later, I am writing this from the back porch of the farmhouse. It is a December morning, cold and clear, the kind that Opa said, let you see further than any other. The pasture is frost-white. The oaks along the fence have lost their leaves, but the structure of them is beautiful. The way bare trees show you what they actually are. All the architecture that the leaves had been keeping private. I have a cup of coffee going warm on the armrest of Opa's chair, which is now simply my chair, though I still think of it as his. The farm is intact. All 212 acres. I moved from Richmond in February. Not a decision I made quickly, but one that had been forming since the afternoon. I sat in this chair and cried for the first time since October. I kept my position at the firm on a consulting basis, which means I drive to Richmond 2 days a week and handle the rest remotely. The commute is manageable. The back porch is not something Richmond has an equivalent of, so the math is straightforward. The tenant cottages on the north boundary are occupied. Mrs. Elaine Fortner, 73, has lived in the larger one for 11 years. She brought me a pie the first week I moved in, sweet potato, from a recipe she said Opa had specifically requested every November. I ate 2 slices standing at the kitchen counter and felt, for the first time in a long time, That I was somewhere I was supposed to be. Robert Aldean. Ace, the neighbor from the south boundary, who had texted me the night of the reading, turned out to be a 70-year-old retired civil engineer who had farmed adjacent land for 30 years and been one of Opa's closest friends for most of that time. We had coffee 3 weeks after the reading. He told me stories about Opa I had never heard, the fence line dispute of 1987 that had nearly become a lawsuit and ended instead with a handshake and a shared harvest. The winter of 2003, when a equipment failure threatened to ruin the season, and Robert's family had helped without being asked. He said Opa had talked about me for years. He said the word Opa always used was steady. I have thought about that word many times since. The Harold Cooper Foundation filed for nonprofit status in January and received its determination letter in April. Its mission is agricultural preservation and rural land stewardship in Albemarle County, specifically supporting family farms facing development pressure, which is most of them and has been for years. Robert Aldean is on the board. James Whitfield serves as legal counsel. A woman named Patricia Ossie, who runs a sustainable agriculture program at the University of Virginia, joined as executive director in June. We have already completed our first project, a conservation easement protecting 60 acres of farmland 2 miles north, land that 3 developers had been circling for a decade. Opa would have approved. I am certain of that. I am also certain he would have had specific opinions about the easement language, which I would have welcomed and incorporated, and he would have been right about at least 2 of them. The Foundation's inaugural gala is scheduled for March. James suggested we hold it at the farm. I agreed. Mrs. Fortner has already volunteered to coordinate the food, which I suspect means the sweet potato pie will be present in significant quantities. And I have no objection to that at all. Derek's situation resolved, as these things do, in the direction the documents pointed. Meridian's civil complaint went to a settlement conference in January. Derek's attorney negotiated a structured repayment agreement, the full $200,000 in deposit funds plus agreed damages, to be paid over 18 months. To fund the first payment, Derek refinanced his house a third time, drawing out what equity remained. His business, a small landscaping operation he had been running for 6 years, lost 2 commercial contracts in November when the Meridian matter became public record, which it did because public records are public, and Derek's attorney had apparently not fully prepared him for that reality. The business has been operating at reduced capacity since. He did not contest the trust. Whether that decision was made by his attorney, by his own arithmetic, or by some remaining functional instinct for self-preservation, I cannot say. The no contest clause was never triggered, which means, technically, there was a residual contingent interest in the trust that survived. A small provision Opa had included, a bequest of $25,000 to Derek upon the trust's settlement. Conditional on non-contest, James called me in February to confirm it was payable. I authorized the payment. I did not call Derek to tell him it was coming. He received it without comment through James's office by check. James told me Derek's attorney called to confirm the funds had cleared and said only, "Please convey our appreciation." I told James, "Note it received." That was the last formal contact. My mother and I have spoken 4 times since October, twice by phone, once when she came to collect some personal items from the farmhouse in December, and once, unexpectedly, at the grocery store in Charlottesville in September, 14 months after Opa died. That last meeting lasted about 8 minutes in the produce section. She looked older. I imagine I do too. She asked how the farm was. I told her it was well. She asked about the foundation. I told her it was growing. She picked up a bag of apples, held it for a moment, and said, "He always did things his own way." I said, "He did." She said, "I should have paid more attention to what that meant." I did not say anything. She put the apples in her cart and we said goodbye the way people do when the script, for what they are to each other, has not yet been rewritten, carefully, without much pressure, leaving room. I do not know what my mother and I will become to each other from here. I know we are not what we were. I know what we were was not working, for either of us, and that the thing which broke it open was not the trust document or the reading or the farm. Those were just the mechanism. The thing underneath was much older and would have had to be addressed eventually regardless. I am willing, when she is ready. That is the most honest thing I can say. On a Thursday in late November, 2 weeks ago, I drove to the cemetery in Clover Hill where Opa is buried. It was late afternoon, the light doing its October thing even in November this year, going gold and long across the headstones. I brought nothing, No flowers, no prepared words. I sat on the ground beside his grave for a while and told him what had happened. The foundation, the easement, Mrs. Fortner's pie, Robert Aldean and his 30 years of adjacent farming and his stories. The chair on the back porch. The frost on the pasture in the mornings. I told him the farm was whole. I told him I understood now what he had meant on that August afternoon when he said he wanted it to mean something after he was gone. Not just money, something. I told him I was going to spend a long time figuring out exactly what that something was and doing it. I told him I thought that was the assignment he had left me. The light shifted. A bird moved in the oak at the cemetery's edge. The afternoon went quiet in the specific way afternoons go quiet in Virginia in late November, complete, undemanding, like a thing that has said everything it needed to say. I drove home in the dark. I turned onto the gravel lane through the east pasture. The farmhouse was lit. The barn held its shape against the sky. The 212 acres lay in their frost and their silence, the same as they had been for 50 years, the same as they would be, long after I was gone too, if I did my job correctly. I parked. I went inside. I made tea and sat in Opa's chair on the back porch in my coat, in the cold, looking out at the dark pasture. I thought, I built nothing yet. But I will. And for the first time in my life, I believed it without reservation. If this story moved you, I want to hear from you in the comments. Tell me, have you ever been the one left sitting in the back row while someone else took credit for a life you helped build? Have you ever stayed quiet when everything in you wanted to speak? Because you knew the right moment hadn't come yet? Because I have. And I want you to know, the right moment does come. It arrives exactly when it was always going to arrive, when you have done the quiet, careful, unglamorous work of preparing for it. My grandfather taught me that. He taught me that dignity is not something you perform in the loud moments. It lives in what you do when no one is watching, in the documents you sign on a Tuesday afternoon, in the promises you keep to people who are no longer here to see you keep them. Hit like if you believe that the truth, when it is properly documented, always finds its way into the right room. Scuster if you have ever chosen patience over performance. And won. I'll see you in the next one.